To the casual observer, Robert Sarge Maxwell was a man defined by stillness. His movements were economical, his voice low, and his life, since returning stateside a decade ago, was characterized by a relentless, almost desperate pursuit of routine. This routine was his self-imposed crucible, hardening the shell around the soft, damaged core of his post-combat soul. He was 42, but his eyes carried the perpetual wariness of a much older man, framed by a prominent, jagged scar, the physical signature of his last, brutal tour. His sanctuary was not grand, it was a modest, pine-paneled home deep enough in the state forest that the noise of the world was muted to a distant hum. This house represented more than shelter, it was a fortress against the chaotic noise that still echoed in his mind. Every hammer swing, every board nailed, every coat of paint applied had been a therapy session of sorts, a deliberate act of building something solid and peaceful atop the shifting sands of memory. Here, the only unexpected sound was the crackle of the wood stove in winter, and the only constant watchman was his dog. Echo, the retired military working dog, MWD, was the other half of this equation. A majestic Belgian Malinois whose coat had begun to silver around his muzzle, Echo was Robert's mirror image in loyalty and quiet trauma. Echo wasn't a comfort animal in the gentle sense, he was a service partner who required and provided structure. His job, even in retirement, was simple: watch the six, never let the threat come from behind. The slight, almost imperceptible hitch in Echo's gait was a souvenir of their time together overseas, a shared wound that created an invisible, unbreakable tether between them. Robert had saved Echo's life once, pulling him from a collapsing structure under fire. Echo had saved Robert's sanity 1,000 times since, simply by existing as a warm, reliable weight at the foot of the bed. Their home, filled with the aroma of pine, old books, and dog hair, was the culmination of their fight for peace, a small, fiercely defended haven where the only rule was unconditional safety. The night the fire started was one of deceptive calm. A cool front had rolled in, and Robert had been reading by the dim light of an old floor lamp. Echo stretched out long and deep in sleep beside the worn leather armchair. There was no premonition, no flicker of dread, just the quiet perfection of a stable evening. The signal of impending catastrophe was so subtle, so mundane, that Robert almost dismissed it. It wasn't the sound of flames, it was the unnatural restlessness of Echo. The dog's low, guttural woof, a sound Robert hadn't heard since they were ambushed outside Kandahar, was followed by the unmistakable thump of Echo's tail against the floor, a staccato rhythm of confused alarm. Then came the smell, not just smoke, but a sharp, biting aroma of electrical insulation melting, quickly overshadowed by a thick, sickly sweet scent of wood beginning to cook. Robert was on his feet instantly. He moved into the short hallway, and the reality slammed into him. A shimmering, orange light was already pulsing from the wall outlet near the coat closet. A hiss, sharp and violent, escalated instantly into the sound of kindling tearing apart. Robert didn't think, he reacted. Echo. Vest up. Now. The dog, already focused, met him halfway, slipping his head into his emergency harness almost before Robert's fingers could secure the clasps. The air was transforming rapidly. Within a minute, the hallway was a lung-searing chimney of smoke. Robert tried to feel the knob of the back door, it was searing hot. The front window became their only chance. He grabbed the heavy, cast-iron boot tray by the door and hurled it through the pane. The glass explosion was immediately swallowed by a much louder, deeper sound, the roar of the fire finding oxygen. They burst through the jagged opening, Robert shielding Echo with his body. They hit the cool, dew-damp earth of the flowerbed outside, collapsing in a desperate heap. The oxygen tasted like sweet salvation, but the sight before them was the very definition of hell made real. The fire, which had been smoldering invisibly in the walls, now possessed the entire structure. It was no longer a house fire, it was a pyre. Robert clung to Echo's leash, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to accept the terrifying truth. Their life, their stability, the last 10 years of hard-won peace, was dissolving into incandescent rage. He watched the old, comforting roof line buckle and dissolve into the vortex of flames. The fire department arrived, sirens wailing a mournful counterpoint to the hungry crackle of the blaze. Robert stood yards away, his arms slung tightly around Echo's neck, the heat radiating off the inferno like a furnace blast. He stayed that way for hours, long after the roof collapsed with a deafening, final shriek of tortured metal, and long after the high-pressure hoses reduced the flames to clouds of steam and smoldering embers. When the sun finally clawed its way over the horizon, casting a weak, orange glow through the residual smoke, it illuminated a scene of absolute, desolate ruin. The only thing left standing was the stone chimney, a grim sentinel overlooking a field of ash and charcoal. Robert walked slowly toward the perimeter tape, his heart beating a hollow, distant rhythm against his ribs. The inventory of loss was not just the structure, it was the total erasure of material history. He knelt near what had been the corner of the living room, touching a mound of fine, talcum-like grey ash. Buried within it were the black, unrecognizable remains of his mother's antique cedar chest, the one thing he'd saved from his childhood. Inside that chest had been the small box containing his military medals and commendations, objects he rarely looked at but felt immense comfort knowing were there, a tangible record of his past service. Gone. He searched the area that had been his small home office. Here, the fire had been most vicious. He found the melted, grotesquely twisted metal of his old typewriter, the tool he had used to write endless, rambling therapeutic journals about his PTSD, the act of writing being his primary means of control. That journal, those countless pages of confession and struggle, were now nothing but a few scraps of curled, blackened carbon paper, unreadable and meaningless. The fire hadn't just taken his possessions, it had annihilated the documentation of his healing. It felt like a deliberate act of spite, wiping the slate clean in the cruelest way possible. The crushing weight of total loss settled over him. What was the point of rebuilding? Where did he even start? He had no ID, no money beyond what was in his wallet, and no physical tie left to his identity except the clothes on his back and the dog at his side. The despair was a suffocating physical presence, closing his throat and blurring his vision. He leaned against a standing fragment of a wall, his chest heaving, the stench of wet ash and smoke filling his senses. He looked down at Echo, whose breathing was steady, whose gaze was fixed. And that's when Robert realized the dog wasn't beside him anymore. Echo had moved, slipping silently through the perimeter tape and settling down. Robert followed his gaze and saw the impossible. Amidst the absolute, smoking wasteland, Echo had chosen a single spot. The dog was sitting rigidly, perfectly composed, on the highest point of the charred wreckage, right where the great stone hearth used to be. The sun hit the ash, making the scene stark and horrifyingly beautiful. Echo was utterly still, the only object on the landscape that did not suggest collapse or ruin, acting not as a victim, but as a sentinel guarding an invisible prize. Robert stared across the scorched earth, his eyes fixed on Echo. The dog sat high on a mound of steaming debris, the pulverized remains of what had been the living room hearth. It was the highest point of the wreckage, a small, dark island in a swirling sea of white ash. Echo's posture was rigid, almost carved from stone, his front paws placed neatly together. His ears were cocked, not moving. He wasn't restless, nor was he trembling. He was simply posted. To Robert, who was navigating the sudden, disorienting abyss of total loss, this image was an anomaly that defied both logic and grief. Most animals, traumatized by fire and dislodged from their environment, would flee, hide, or circle anxiously. Echo was doing none of those things. He was holding a specific piece of ground, a space now defined only by its absence. Robert began his approach, wading through the ruins. The ground was treacherous, slick with water, dusted with fine ash, and scattered with sharp, blackened fragments of their life. As he drew within 10 feet, he called out, his voice hoarse from the smoke, "Echo, let's go, buddy. Come on." He knelt, producing a tattered tennis ball, the one toy Echo never failed to chase. The dog did not move. He didn't even glance at the ball. He let out a low, almost imperceptible growl not directed at Robert, but around him. It was a sound Robert knew intimately from their patrols, the subtle, professional warning of a perimeter breach. "This ground," the dog was signaling, "is currently under my watch." Robert's heart constricted with a powerful, confusing mixture of despair and awe. He tried to reason with the dog, using the soft, reassuring tone reserved only for Echo. "There's nothing left here, old man. It's just ash. We've got to leave." He stretched his hand out, But Echo responded with an unmistakable shift of weight, subtly challenging the movement. Robert knew better than to force a former MWD when it was locked onto an objective. He retreated a few paces and watched, trying to understand the logic of the sentinel. Why this particular spot? It was where the stone hearth had been, the place where they often sat, Robert reading, Echo half asleep. It was the warmest spot in the winter. But today, it was simply the hottest, physically, painfully hot, still radiating the residual heat of the furnace. Yet, Echo remained, enduring the heat, his focus unbroken. The dog wasn't guarding a possession, he was guarding the concept of home itself. He was proving, by his unwavering presence, that even when the house was gone, the foundation of their bond was still solid, still worth protecting. The dog had become Robert's new, living hearth, a point of warmth and certainty amidst the chilling nothingness. As the morning wore on, Robert sat on a fallen cinderblock several yards away, giving Echo his space. He began to sift through the ruins adjacent to the dog's vigil, not looking for salvage, but conducting an inventory of his soul, a painful exercise in confronting the totality of his loss. He found the charred outline of his old guitar, the one he had learned to play during a slow, painful recovery at the VA hospital. Its neck was warped, the strings melted down to tiny, coppery puddles. Music had been another pillar of his stability, a way to express the emotions words failed to capture. Now, the music was silenced. He found the melted, fused remains of his small library books on history, philosophy, and, ironically, survivalism. All gone. The sheer weight of the immaterial loss, the loss of routine, of sanctuary, of memory markers, threatened to crush him entirely. He saw his life stretching before him as an endless, empty plain. He was a veteran who had fought his way back from physical and psychological ruin, only to have his entire foothold on normalcy incinerated in a few short hours. He was adrift. He was failing his own stability protocol. He glanced back at Echo. The dog hadn't budged. A small sparrow landed tentatively on a still-smoking beam nearby. Echo's eyes tracked it briefly, a flicker of the old hunter, but the dog immediately returned his gaze to the empty space before him. This wasn't merely a dog waiting for its owner, this was a soldier on watch. This unwavering focus forced a crucial shift in Robert's perspective, unlocking a cascade of painful but ultimately redemptive memories. He remembered a night in a remote firebase, pinned down by mortar fire, when the only way to avoid a direct hit was to lie still in a freezing, muddy ditch for 4 hours. His muscles were screaming, his resolve dissolving, but Echo, curled tight against his chest, never complained, never moved, never wavered. Echo's stillness had been Robert's lifeline. Hold the line. Stay put. It was in that moment, watching his dog endure the scorching ground and the emotional vacuum, that Robert realized the profound meaning of the vigil. Echo wasn't guarding the past home, he was guarding the future one. By refusing to move, he was communicating the foundational, non-negotiable truth of their bond: I am here. We are safe. The only thing that truly matters did not burn. Robert finally stood and walked toward the dog again, this time not with a leash, but with reverence. He didn't approach as an owner commanding a pet, but as a subordinate approaching a commanding officer. He sank onto his knees just outside the ring of ash that marked the boundary of Echo's post. You're right, old man, Robert whispered, the words catching in his throat. You're absolutely right. He remembered the day he retired Echo. The paperwork had been bureaucratic and sterile, but the moment the dog was formally handed over to him, no longer property, but partner, was the real contract. Robert had promised him rest, security, and peace. Now, the fire had stolen the peace, but Echo was fiercely enforcing the security. Robert had been so focused on the material security that was gone that he had failed to see the emotional security that was standing right there. This insight broke through the wall of Robert's despair like a flashbang. The house was merely a structure. The home was the unspoken trust that flowed between man and dog. That trust was fireproof. It was the single, invaluable asset the inferno could not consume. Robert extended his hand slowly, gently, toward Echo's harness. This time, there was no growl, no resistance. Echo simply leaned into the touch, a deep, rumbling sigh escaping his chest, acknowledging the shared understanding. Robert ran his hand over the dog's strong, aging back, feeling the familiar, reassuring rhythm of his breath. The heat of the scorched earth radiated up, but the warmth radiating from the dog was stronger, a deeper, essential warmth. He stayed there for a long time, not talking, just breathing in time with Echo. He wasn't grieving anymore, he was grounding. The single spot was not a monument to loss, but a stubborn, heroic declaration of unbroken duty. Echo had saved him again, not from a mortar round or a roadside bomb, but from the silent, invisible enemy of paralyzing sorrow. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Robert finally made a choice. He wouldn't try to pull Echo away. He would simply join him. He sat down, leaning his back against the cool, rough surface of the chimney's remnant. For the first time since the fire, Robert closed his eyes and felt something other than terror and emptiness. He felt the weight of loyalty, and he realized that as long as they sat there together, they had everything they needed to start over. The vigil continued, but now, the soldier had rejoined his sentinel. Robert and Echo spent the night curled together amidst the ruins, the chill of the forest air cutting through the residual warmth of the ash. Robert found an old, singed tarp in his truck and draped it over them, trying to create a semblance of shelter. He slept fitfully, but each time he stirred, Echo was there, a warm, solid presence, still facing the empty space where their hearth had been. The dog's unwavering commitment was a strange, powerful comfort, a silent promise that some things, indeed, could not be burned away. The following morning, a local news crew, having caught wind of the veteran's tragic loss, arrived at the property. The reporter, a young woman named Sarah Jenkins, was empathetic but cautious, wary of intruding on such raw grief. She approached Robert carefully, offering condolences and asking if he'd be willing to share his story. Robert, still numb, muttered a few words about losing everything, his voice raspy from smoke and sorrow. But it wasn't Robert's words that captured the world's attention. It was the unforgettable image Sarah's photographer, a seasoned veteran named Mike, instinctively captured. From a distance, framed by the skeletal remains of trees and the still smoking debris, was the stark, poignant tableau. Robert, his face etched with unspeakable loss, sitting on a cinderblock, his arm draped protectively around Echo. And Echo, the grizzled Malinois, sat not looking at his owner, but fixed, vigilant, and absolutely unmoving, on the very center of the ash pile, the single spot. The photograph was hauntingly simple yet spoke volumes. It wasn't just a picture of a dog in mourning, it was a testament to unconditional loyalty in the face of absolute devastation. It was published in the local paper that afternoon, then picked up by regional news outlets, and within hours, it exploded across social media. #Echo the Sentinel and #Veteran's Best Friend began trending. People saw more than just a veteran's loss, they saw a symbol of enduring hope, a visceral representation of the kind of steadfast love that truly defines home. Comments flooded in by the thousands. That dog is holding the line, this is what loyalty looks like, he knows his mission, protect his human. The image resonated deeply with military families, animal lovers, and anyone who understood the quiet strength of devotion. It was a digital wildfire of compassion, spreading faster and wider than the inferno that had consumed Robert's home. The world had found its unexpected hero in an old war dog. The immediate aftermath of the viral photo was overwhelming. Robert, who had always preferred solitude, suddenly found himself the reluctant recipient of a deluge of goodwill. His old flip phone, which he'd miraculously saved, began ringing incessantly. Local veteran organizations were among the first to respond. The Veterans Outreach Alliance immediately secured a temporary, pet-friendly cabin for Robert and Echo. They delivered bags of quality dog food, blankets, and a plush new bed for Echo, a small gesture that brought a lump to Robert's throat. He hadn't realized how much the simple comforts mattered until they were gone. One of their volunteers, a kind, retired Army medic named Brenda, became Robert's de facto liaison, helping him navigate the flood of offers. The local community rallied with astonishing speed. Restaurants offered free meals, hardware stores donated tools and building materials, and local contractors volunteered their time. A GoFundMe page, started by Sarah Jenkins, the reporter, amassed tens of thousands of dollars in just 2 days. People from across the country, moved by Echo's unyielding vigil, sent small, handwritten cards, expressing solidarity and gratitude for Robert's service. One package, addressed simply to Echo, the Sentinel, contained a new, military-grade chew toy, a tactical squeaky squirrel. What struck Robert most profoundly was not the monetary value of the donations, but the sheer humanity of it all. He had spent years feeling isolated, a relic of a past war, misunderstood by a world that had moved on. Now, through Echo, he was seeing the best of that world. The community's response was a tangible demonstration that he was not alone, that his story mattered, and that the sacrifice of his service, and Echo's, was still honored. He stood in the temporary cabin, watching Echo gnaw contentedly on his new squirrel, and felt a fragile, unfamiliar sensation stir within him: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that rebuilt a house, but the kind that rebuilt a spirit. Brenda, the volunteer, sat with Robert one afternoon, poring over blueprints for a modest, fire-resistant replacement home. "We have enough funds, Sarge," she said softly, "and enough volunteers to break ground next month. We can even salvage some of the original stone from the chimney for the new hearth." Robert traced the outline of the proposed house with a calloused finger. He was still processing the idea of a new home. It felt almost like a betrayal of the old one, and of Echo's fierce loyalty to its memory. But then he remembered Echo, still occasionally pulling him towards the ash pile, nudging him to survey the post. The dog wasn't asking for the old home, he was demonstrating a readiness to re-establish the sanctuary. The plan began to take shape. The new house would be built on the same footprint, designed with more modern safety features. Crucially, the hearth, the symbolic single spot, would be central and prominent, ensuring Echo's post had a new, solid anchor. Robert even envisioned a small, dedicated space for Echo's old service vest, a place of honor. The rebuilding wasn't just about lumber and nails, it was about resurrection. It was about transforming the physical scar on the land into a beacon of resilience. Robert thought about how he would feel walking into that new house, not as a victim of fire, but as a survivor, accompanied by his unyielding partner. The story of the veteran and his war dog, published and reshared countless times, became more than a news piece, it became a modern parable. It illustrated that true wealth isn't measured in possessions, but in the unbreakable bonds of loyalty and love. Echo, the old war dog, had not just guarded a pile of ash, he had stood vigil over the very essence of humanity's capacity for compassion and resilience. Months later, Robert and Echo stood on a new, unburnt porch, gazing out at the familiar forest. The scent of fresh wood replaced the stench of ash. The sound of birdsong replaced the mournful crackle of flames. Inside, a new, clean hearth waited, ready to be kindled. Echo, older now, his gait a little more deliberate, still had that watchful intensity in his eyes. He occasionally nudged Robert toward the new hearth, as if to say, "This is the spot. This is where we guard now." Robert knew, with a certainty that transcended the pain of memory, that the fire had been a crucible. It had stripped away everything but the absolute essentials. It had revealed that home isn't built of wood, plaster, or possessions. Home is built of unbroken trust, shared history, and the unwavering presence of a loyal heart. Echo, the old war dog, had lost his physical home, but his spirit had never faltered. His unwavering vigil over that single spot of ash had not just saved Robert's spirit, it had ignited a flame of hope in thousands of others. The new house was a testament, not to what was lost, but to what was found, the enduring, irreplaceable hearth of the human and canine heart. And as Robert watched Echo settle into a comfortable sprawl before the new, unlit fireplace, he knew he hadn't lost everything in the fire. He had simply learned, definitively, what truly mattered.